the U.S. State Department has hit on Russia for its decision to expel the diplomats in Moscow. In fact, it says that Moscow is not interested in diplomacy and Washington reserves the right to take further action. A State Department spokeswoman, Heather Nauer, told reporters that U.S. Reserve has a right to respond. She added that Russia is further isolating itself following the brazen chemical attack in the United Kingdom.
We are witnessing obvious prevention of access for Russian representatives to Russian victims. With these methods, Great Britain openly and without any constraint violates international law, and in particular the Consular Convention between the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland of 1968.
And we are joined by Steve Mott, a correspondent from Washington, D.C. live. Steve, after the U.S. expelled 60 diplomats and the Russian consulate in Seattle has been closed, Moscow has expelled the same number of diplomats. This is not a very surprising move, is it, Steve?
No, that's right. Certainly Washington had been saying that they did anticipate this taking place. This is a statement just within the last couple of hours from the White House. We heard from the State Department earlier. The White House press secretary now weighing in with this. The Russian action today to expel American diplomats marks a further deterioration in United States-Russia relationship. The expulsion of undeclared Russian intelligence officers by the United States and more than 24 U.S. allies and NATO allies earlier this week was an appropriate response, according to the White House, to the Russian attack on the soil of the United Kingdom. Russia's response was not unanticipated, says the White House, going to what you were saying there, and the United States will deal with it. So obviously the White House leaving some ambiguity here in Washington tonight about what will come next. Ambiguity, of course, that was also echoed by the State Department earlier when the spokeswoman said that the State Department and diplomats were reviewing the situation and that they will respond accordingly. So the big question here in Washington is what happens next? Will Washington go down the route of expelling more Russian diplomats? You know, what we're hearing from some folks here in town is that there is a feeling in the corridors of power in Washington that maybe this is an opportunity to step back a little bit, to take a breather, try not to escalate this further. Certainly that is something that both sides, both Russia and the United States, will want, but we just have to wait and see which way the Trump administration decides to go.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you raised that issue of escalating of tensions. Do you see this the beginning of maybe further escalating tensions between the US and Russia? Now, we are taking into account the recent back and forth on Russian meddling in the 2016 elections.
Yeah, that's right. That's an interesting question that you raise, of course, as well, because this is a fraught relationship and has been a fraught relationship since the election. Of course, Russia has been accused of interfering in the 2016 presidential election on behalf of President Trump. Of course, the big elephant in the room here is the one person that we haven't heard speak explicitly about the latest expulsions by Russia. Not only that, but also about the chemical weapon attack inside the UK is President Trump himself. President Trump has been broadly silent in criticism of Russia and also Russian leader Vladimir Putin. So obviously a lot of the unknowns here in Washington come from the fact that the president himself has been somewhat reluctant to criticize Russia. Of course, a lot of his top aides have not been so backward in coming forward about their criticism of Russia. Obviously, a lot will depend now on the incoming staff that President Trump has hired. His new national security advisor, of course, John Bolton, and the incoming Secretary of State, or at least the nominee for Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, are both known as hawks on Russia. They take a hard line on Russia. They favor steeper sanctions. They favor a tougher line from Washington against Russian President Vladimir Putin. Will the president listen to their advice now? You could be rest assured that if these two men themselves have their way, then you will see a further deterioration and more diplomatic action. But at the moment, it really is kind of an unknown quantity as the investigation into Russian meddling by the special counsel Robert Mueller continues apace here in Washington.
Right, Steve. Now the NATO and the 25 allies, including Germany and France, expelled more than 150 Russian diplomats this week in support of the UK, which kicked out 23 Kremlin envoys. Do you feel that Russia has started to feel the pressure right now?
Well, that's a good question, and certainly the United States had hoped to present a united front. It was pretty unprecedented, the numbers that were expelled. In fact, the largest expulsion of Russian diplomats internationally in history, some 150 Russian diplomats in all. And the United States had been very keen to show that this was a united position. It was important that it wasn't just the UK and the US who were anticipated to respond, but also other countries in the European Union, Australia, and other European countries as well that were not or are not part of the European Union, to sort of show a united front. Georgia added to the list today, the State Department welcoming that, given that Georgia is on the doorstep of Russia. You know, it was important, saying the United States, to do that, to present that united front, because it is of concern to the international community. And in fact, we heard today the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, actually making clear that he is concerned about the deterioration in diplomatic relations between Washington and Moscow, urging the re-establishment of the hotline. That's the line between the two capitals that was open during the Cold War in order to stave off any threat of nuclear strikes on each other. Now urging that that hotline and that infrastructure that was in place in the Cold War be re-established to try to avoid any further deterioration in relations. So certainly the international community is very concerned and watching this very closely.
Right, Steve. Thank you for getting us all those details. That was our correspondent, Steve Mott, live from Washington, D.C. He was telling us all about the latest development in the issue of the expulsion of 60 diplomats from Russia, U.S. diplomats from Russia, in response to U.S. expelling 60 Russian diplomats from its soil. Thank you so much, Steve.